On your mic. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I feel very fortunate in being able to welcome Mara here to join us for our third and final of our Winter Talk series. It's been lovely to put these together, and to finish with somebody like Mara is really exciting for me. So thank you so much for coming on, first of all, Mara. And if you'd like to all put your hands together, please, for Britain's second fastest lady.
At the moment.
At the moment, yeah. Yes,
thank you very much, Jim, for the introduction. And good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming on this horrible, horrible winter night. I made it as far as the car park, and then I couldn't get into the building because it was so wild and rainy. I got to know Jim through my mum, who's one of his patients, and nearly every time I see her, she says, "Oh, I must go and see Jim about my dodgy legs," and I'm thinking this is going to be me in 20 years' time. all the miles of marathon running catch up with me. So anyway, thank you very much for organising everything. Thank you for having me. So I'm the last in your series on distance running this winter, so I'm assuming that you know everything there is to know about marathon running. I'll just put a bit of icing on the cake to finish it off. So let's have a show of hands. Who's doing a marathon this spring? Oh, loads of people. Fantastic. Okay. And anybody else coaching marathon runners? Or yep. Okay, quite a mix. Fantastic. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is relevant to the shorter distances as well as the marathon. I don't have much experience of ultra running as yet, or I don't know if that will ever change. But so a lot of what I talk about is relevant to the shorter distances. So if you're not a marathon runner, don't worry. There'll be plenty to learn about and discuss. And I'd really love to hear lots and lots of questions after you've stocked up on alcoholic beverages after the break. But if as I'm going along you don't understand anything or you want to ask questions, please just interrupt and ask. So I said in the intro, for now I'm the second fastest British female marathon runner, but there are now four youngsters snapping at my heels, and they'll all probably be doing the London Marathon in April because it's the trials for the Tokyo Olympics. So make sure you watch that if you're not running. Should be really exciting. I think most of them were wearing these, in fact all of them had these carbon blade shoes on, which I don't know if we'll get into that debate, it could take all night. But, so I'm kind of thinking, yeah, they reckon three minutes for, this is somebody who did some analysis on marathon times, and they reckon 3 minutes for elite female marathon runners. So I now say, oh yes, I've done 2:20, yes, nice. Yeah. Okay, so let's go on to the first slide. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about training, and then I'll go on to injury prevention, race preparation, and race strategies on nutrition and also mental things. Because I know you had a talk on nutrition earlier in this series. But I wanted to talk about training first because I think there are a lot of, it's easy to forget that the marathon is fundamentally an aerobic event and quite different to the shorter events. So what I mean by that is you have to run a marathon well below your maximal speed without building up too much lactic acid, without doing it too anaerobically. Because if you run it really fast anaerobically, as you can run 5k, 10k, even a half marathon, what's likely to happen is you will run out of carbohydrate, which is that dreaded hitting the wall. Anybody here hit the wall? Yes, okay, good. Most marathon runners have experienced it. So it's really, really important to understand that the marathon is physiologically quite a different event to the shorter events. A lot of athletes in the UK, if they've come from a 10k or cross-country background or background of shorter events, they think, okay, I'll just keep doing the same and add a longer long run. And I did that for several years at the beginning. And if you do that, then you'll probably end up doing really top quality training, like interval training, and then you'll probably do easy recovery runs, but there'll be a whole swathe of speeds in between that you might be missing. Hopefully you're not, but I think this is quite common, so I just wanted to emphasise that the marathon is an aerobic event, and therefore fat burning and doing plenty of training well below your maximum speed is really important. I'm not saying just go out and do lots of easy jogging, because that means you'll be missing out on lots of potential adaptation, but speeds between easy jogging and intervals are really important for the marathon. When you're training, make increments slowly. When you're building up, obviously, probably a lot of you now are building up into your marathon training, so I hope you haven't gone from 30 miles to 60 miles or anything like that. But the reason making increments slowly is important is because it allows for adaptation. So when you train, you actually damage your body. So you get muscle micro tears, you get micro damage, you get fatigued, depleted of fuel, and so on. And then when you're resting after training, your body adapts to that stimulus. And that adaptation is the process which makes you go faster. So you might grow more capillaries, grow more mitochondria, that sort of thing. And it's that adaptation which actually makes you go faster. It's not the training itself. The training is the stimulus for adaptation. So you have to allow enough time, energy, and so on for that adaptation to occur. And if you, ideally, you increase your training in small increments, and your body can keep adapting to those small increments. If you build up your training too quickly, your body probably won't adapt at that pace, and that's when you tend to get into overtraining, injuries, that kind of thing. So coming back to the marathon being an aerobic event, what kind of key types of training are important in that respect? So for me, the top priorities are long run, because the marathon is a long event, obviously. I know you all know this. So what kind of long runs are good? So I think there are different types of long runs you can usually do. So one is a really long run. So that could be anything from sort of 22 to 24 miles, or even beyond the marathon distance. That's if you're quite an experienced runner. If you're quite a newcomer to running, then what's a really long run will be relative to what you've done before. So if you've previously only done, say, or if you've previously done 12 miles, let's say, then 16 miles or 18 miles will be relatively a really long run. So a really long run, you get a lot of fuel depletion, it's a lot of time on your feet. You might be out there for the time it's going to take you to run the marathon itself. So lots of benefits there, but if it's a really long run, then you obviously can't do it that fast. Then other types of long runs are slightly shorter long runs, but done at a slightly more brisk pace. So if you imagine just not being able to have a conversation, that's what I call fast jog speed, and I'll come on to that. That's the kind of speed that you might be able to do some or all of a shorter long run. So because it's a little bit faster, you need to keep the distance down a bit. Then another variation is to throw in a little bit of quality into a long run. So perhaps something like surges, or if you come to hills, do a hill a couple of times. At the end, in the last few miles, you could do something like 1 minute a bit faster, 1 minute easy, 1 minute faster, 1 minute easy. So just rather than just sort of plodding the whole way, you can throw in a bit of extra stimulus to make it even more quality. And then the second type of top priority sessions are threshold runs or long intervals. So people use different words to describe the same thing in running. So what I mean by a threshold run is a run done relatively fast, so you're working hard, but you keep it going for quite a long time. So anything over about 7 minutes, so it's quite a long time. If you're doing one single effort, it might be 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. If you're really experienced, it might be an hour. But it's a long time, but you're running fast, but you can keep it going for a long time. So obviously it's going to be slower than you might do 400 meter reps or even mile reps. And the purpose of doing that is to get your lactic acid relatively high, not really high, but relatively high, and then keep it there, and your heart rate as well, and keep it there, and learn to tolerate that quite intense effort, but for a long time. I've said threshold runs or long intervals because for me they kind of amount to the same thing. If you're doing long intervals, which could be anything from about 5 minutes upwards, it's kind of the same thing as doing one long effort. So let's say you might do a 20-minute tempo run. For me, doing 4 times 5 minutes is effectively the same thing because they're quite long efforts. In the 4 by 5 minutes, yes, you have little breaks along the way, but it's basically a long sustained effort. And then the fast jog is the speed where you just can't have a conversation. So if you imagine doing a nice easy jog where you can talk freely, if you go a bit faster than that, to the point where you just can't have a conversation, that's what I call fast jog. And the reason that's important is it because it maximally burns fat, and it's the maximum speed you can do aerobically. So lactic acid is not building up, but if you went any faster, it would start to build up. So it's not intervals, it's not tempo or threshold or anything like that, but it's also not easy jogging. So that fast jog pace, particularly, I think a lot of people overlook that, and that's really important for building a big aerobic engine. Hills, having said these are the top 3 sessions, I'm now going to talk about hills just to confuse you. Hills, I think, are a really good form of training because they're a form of strength training. So those of us who are getting into the senior ranks, strength training is really, really important. I would do them as often as you possibly can. Not necessarily hill repeats, but just incorporating hills into your training, into your regular everyday training. Hill sprints is a type of training that I picked up from an Italian coach, where you do very short but sort of maximal intensity hill sprints, and then you just walk back down nice and easily. And what that's supposed to do is make your heart go from sort of 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, like a car. So trying to get maximal effort quickly. And because they're very short sprints, they don't really amount to a session, but it's the sort of thing that you can throw into a steady run or at the end of an interval session, just to add a little bit of extra stimulus. Uphill runs is another type of hill training that I've done a little bit of. It's a little bit difficult to do around here, but if you're ever in the mountains or in Scotland or somewhere, you can find a course that goes gradually uphill over a long time, like 5k, 10k or more. That's a really great form of training. You can also, of course, do it on a treadmill. It's less interesting, but so when you say hills, a lot of people think just hill repeats, where you work hard up the hill and the easy jog down, and that is a good form of training. But hills you can incorporate into your training in lots of other ways as well. Strength training, I'm a really big fan of, because mainly for injury prevention, but also for making you run more efficiently. And top of my list on that is glute muscles, so your bum muscles. So most of the runners I see have some level of glute dysfunction, and that's, I think, basically because we all spend a lot of time sitting down, which switches off your glute muscles and tightens the muscles at the front of your hip. So any kind of strength training, really, really good. Put your hands up if you do some kind of strength training. Okay, so fair few, good. Yep. I mean, what runners enjoy is running. It's not generally not the stretching and the cross training and all the rest of it. So it can be quite difficult to incorporate into your routine, but I think a really short routine, even just 10-15 minutes, which you can do at home using body weight, is really worth it. Don't feel you have to go to a gym and lift heavy weights. I think you can actually do a lot at home. And then cross training. Anybody here do cross training? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think cross training can be really valuable. Things like aqua jogging, indoor bike, swimming, not so much road cycling, but especially as we get older, the pounding and impact of running can cause a lot of wear and tear. So cross training can be a really valuable way of getting enough aerobic, cardiovascular training without the impact. Does anyone have questions about training before we move on? Yeah.
How does the fast pace relate to, say, marathon pace or half marathon pace?
Yeah.
A certain amount away from one of those
Yeah.
paces?
So, in theory, when you're running at really easy speeds, your lactic acid will typically be 1 millimole in your bloodstream. And then once you get to the fast jog speed, it will just start to creep up. So fast jog is basically 1 millimole. It's kind of the end of the easy speeds. A marathon race, a sort of ballpark figure is 2 millimoles. So it's significantly higher than fast jog. And then half marathon, probably something like 3 or 4 millimoles. And then you get into kind of 5K, 1500 metre running where it might be sort of up to 20. So it should be slower than marathon pace. The only thing to kind of keep in mind there is if you've set yourself a target marathon pace which is actually too slow for your level of fitness, and you then go out and run that pace, it might be that it's actually really easy. So I come across this a lot. So people say, right, my marathon target pace is 3.5 hours, say, and I go and run at that speed, but it's really easy. So I say, okay, I think you're capable of doing a marathon much faster than that, because because you should be able to finish a marathon at a speed which is significantly faster than really easy. Any other questions on training? Yeah.
Yeah, just the sprints uphill. So how many of those would you do? I mean, you said you're not trying to. It wouldn't be a full session, so it's not about covering a certain 4 or 5 Ks in total. But
Yeah.
how many would you recommend of those?
So I used to do 5 or 6, and I would use a tarmac hill so that you can get some speed up. Quite steep, but quite short. So it could be, you're really supposed to only do them for up to about 10 seconds. So when we talk about hills, people typically think sort of 30 seconds, a minute, even longer. But these are really short sprints, and they're supposed to be kind of maximal power. Yeah. Have you ever tried that kind of?
Yeah, I've done it sort of on a, like a bridge over a road. It's got a short sort of ramp.
Yeah.
But only tried it once or twice.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on training? Okay, let's move on. Okay. So still on the subject of training, I just wanted to mention rest and recovery, because this is really vital for that adaptation that I was talking about earlier. The training is not what makes you fitter and faster, it's the recovery and adaptation afterwards. The cycle of adaptation, so you train, adapt, train, adapt, train, adapt. Over time, that's what makes you get fitter, hopefully, if you're doing the right sort of training. That's a very individual thing according to your age, your history of training, how much training you're doing, that sort of thing. And if you're not getting fitter over time, there could be a number of reasons for that. So the training may not be hard enough, so you're not getting enough stimulus from your training to adapt. It could be that the training is too hard, so you're training and then you're not really adapting enough before you train again because it's just too much. It could be that the rest is not enough, and in those sorts of scenarios your performances will plateau or even get worse. So what's really important is what works for you. So since you're all in a club environment, if you find your performance is plateauing but all your teammates are doing kind of, you know, the same as you, the same training as you, you might ask yourselves, okay, is this training too much for me, or am I not recovering enough, or is it sort of not hard enough? So in club environments, you tend to be doing roughly the same training, which of course, you know, is much easier training in a group. But it may be that on the days when you're not at the club, you might need to just tinker with your training to get that cycle working for you. And then if you are on a improving trajectory, so if you are improving over time, that's an indicator that that cycle of adaptation is working for you. You've kind of cracked it, that combination of training and adaptation. So in that situation, my advice is it ain't broke, don't fix it. So just keep doing what you're doing. The only thing better than that is to improve more rapidly. So if you are improving, I would just keep doing more and more of what you're doing. So I was often on an improving trajectory, but I got too sort of greedy and impatient and changed things, and then ended up sort of plateauing or getting worse. And looking back, I think, oh, you know, I found what worked for me. I should have just stuck at it. So we're all quite impatient as endurance runners. So if you are improving, just relish it. Sleep, obviously, really important. I'm sure you've all got really busy lives and don't have the luxury of sleeping in the afternoon, except maybe on a Sunday. But yeah, rest is really, really key after training. And then quick refueling after training, if you can, to help get that adaptation cycle going quickly straight after training. And then things like massage, stretching, ice baths, compression, those are all just things that you can do to help with rest and recovery. And then also having an easy week every 4 to 5 weeks. Does anybody have an easy week now and again? Yeah? Okay, fantastic. That's good. Okay, let's talk about injury prevention. So, know your body and common sense. This is, I guess this is just what I learned from years of dealing with injuries, and it always seemed to get too overcomplicated. So a lot of injuries come from some sort of biomechanical imbalance, and that might be, for example, you've got one leg longer than the other, or if you've played asymmetrical sports like racket sports, if you've had an accident or a surgery, a lot of injuries crop up from those sorts of things. And if you go to a doctor, they might say, oh, have an MRI, or often I've found in the past that dealing with injuries often becomes a lot more complicated than it needs to be. Jim, please interrupt and disagree with me if you if you're on dealing with injuries.
You're quite right.
So, to give you an example, I had a high hamstring tendinopathy in 2011, and it took ages to figure out what was causing it, and I was going to have surgery and had all these scans, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, it was just that my glutes on that side weren't firing properly. So the hamstrings got overloaded and the tendon got degenerated. So often injuries will be caused by something very simple like that. Plantar fasciitis also I managed to get from poor glute function. So if you keep getting the same injury, the same niggles, just being aware of that and trying to figure out what the cause could be so that it doesn't happen again. Tackle pain early. How many of us have tried to run through injuries? Often, unless it's a really acute injury, in which case rest is important. Often complete rest isn't necessarily the best way to deal with injuries, because as soon as you're completely resting, you start losing your strength, you might lose flexibility, you might lose joint mobility. So often some level of training actually is helpful for injuries. For example, tendon injuries, they need to be loaded. So tendons, if you just leave them, they won't recover very well, but if you load them, especially eccentric loading, which is loading while stretching, then that is what will repair them, and running is a form of loading. Glutes, I go on and on and on ad infinitum about glutes because glute dysfunction is really common in endurance runners, but it's a real source of other injuries. So if your glutes are not working very well, then maybe not firing or lacking strength, or you maybe have a bit of asymmetry going on, then other places are going to take the strain, like your knees, feet, hamstrings, lower back. So as much as you possibly can, blitz your glutes at all times. Does anyone do any glute specific exercises? Yeah? You do them all the time?
I have a hip flexor and piriformis issues. So
Okay.
I find, it's made a difference actually.
Yeah. Okay. What sort of exercises are you doing?
So donkey kicks.
Donkey kicks,
and,
yeah.
I can't remember what they're called, but when you do that.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So and also the back and straight leg.
And you're on your fours? Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Gosh, what else?
Glute bridges?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Okay.
Mainly though, rather than just stretching, I'll be doing dynamic stuff.
Dynamic stuff,
Hold
yeah.
stretch.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. In the Q&A time, we can go through some exercises if anyone wants to do that. Yeah. Sorry, you have a question?
Yeah, I think I've noticed I've had a lot less injuries since I've been doing Pilates, and we incorporate lots of glute work.
Yeah.
I've noticed a big difference in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Is that with the reformer, or
Sorry?
is that with the reformer Pilates machine, or is it
No,
with
it's a
a
Pilates
just?
class, so it's
just your body
freeform,
weight?
yes,
Yeah.
freeform, doing a lot of the clams and the bridge work,
Yeah.
and just a lot of glute work. It's only
Yeah.
once a week for 45 minutes.
And have you
But
noticed a
yeah,
difference?
it's made a big difference. So
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Glutes.
Okay. Okay, brilliant. And then PF stands for plantar fasciitis and hamstrings. Those are my injury specialities. Anyone had plantar fasciitis? Yeah. Yeah, quite difficult to get rid of. Have you got it at the moment?
I haven't had it for a number of years, but I think a lot of TA calf stretching help come in.
Okay.
Because if they're tight, the pressure goes onto your plantar fascia because you
Yeah.
calcane your calf move.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, everything's in a chain. So your glutes, hamstrings, calves, plantar fascia. So if you've got tightness elsewhere, often you'll cause problems further along the chain. Yeah.
I also had hamstring tendinopathy
Okay.
a couple of years ago. It took ages to get rid of, and basically I found out that because I'm very small,
Yeah.
I always tend to sit back in the car, especially driving
Okay.
the car,
Yeah.
and when I'm working in front of the computer. So I said
Okay.
I tend to sink at the chair at the back, so I put like a cushion, which is the opposite direction, like a
Okay.
tilting cushion,
Yeah.
just to force my body weight to go forward a bit in both the car and
Oh,
my
okay.
working chair. And since then, the tendinopathy has been under control, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So previously, maybe your hamstrings were being excessively stretched.
Probably,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And the nerves as well. So now they're a bit more like that.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, so that comes under the common sense thing. You could be obsessing about treatment for your hamstrings, but a cushion in the car is sort of all that it took to clear it up.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, things like, new new chair at work, or new footwear is a really common one. Or I've heard people talk about plantar fasciitis and foot trouble in the early summer, when a lot of people will start wearing sandals, which may have much less cushion than what they've been wearing in winter. So often can be a really obvious solution. Don't be dazzled. That's what I mean by that is, don't be dazzled by people telling you you have to have all sorts of injections and scans and complicated treatments, because often it can be solved quite simply. And then finally, this point actually should have been at the top of the list, but strength and conditioning for me is the key thing for injury prevention, because injuries really are a reflection that your body is not strong and robust enough to cope with the amount of running that you're making it do. So if you're really strong and tough and you go out and run 100 odd miles a week and you're perfectly fine, that shows that your body is strong enough. But if you don't have the strength and a well-conditioned body to cope with training, then injury will often be the result. Yeah. On strength and conditioning, I take a very sort of basic, simple approach and go back to what are the key muscle groups, what are the most important muscle groups for running. And for me that is glutes, hamstrings, calves and core. Less so upper body, quads if you're doing a lot of hilly running, but really glutes, hamstrings, calves, core are the key for me. So I try to focus on those and try and do as much as possible single-legged. So for example, with squats, you could do double leg or single leg, the same with the glute bridge. Because if you do double leg and you have some asymmetry, then the weak leg will tend to just go along for the ride and the strong leg will do a lot of the work. So doing single leg exercises, you can really, there's no escape for the working leg, they've just got to do the work. Yeah. Anything on strength and conditioning or injury stuff before we move on? Yeah.
With strength and conditioning, is it something that you should be, is it like you can do it once a week and it helps, or you should be doing it kind of like a couple of times a week? You do it just maybe 20 minutes or something like that? Does it really
Yeah. So I would say you need to do twice a week at least to kind of get any gains. I think once a week probably just isn't frequent enough to get much gain. And I think it's the sort of thing which lends itself to doing probably 4 to 6 weeks reasonably kind of intensively, so that you can get clear progress and develop strength and mastery of exercises, and then you can go on to a lighter kind of maintenance load. Because it's difficult to do a full-on strength and conditioning program if you're doing a lot of running as well, because it can just become too much, and then the danger is that you're not recovering enough and you get sort of excessive, overtrained. So I would say twice a week if possible. An alternative approach is to do it more frequently but less. So for example, doing a quick 5 to 10 minutes before running, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. Maybe if you're doing speed sessions, you could do quick 5 to 10 minutes before speed sessions. So I think it depends really on practicalities and your lifestyle. So if you're, for example, having to run super early and adding in another 10 minutes is just, means less sleep, then maybe not. But for example, if you have a club track night and the first 20 minutes is spent sort of catching up and chatting, you could be doing a little bit of strength and conditioning in that time and still talk. But so I think it boils down a lot to how much time you've got available, where you're going to be doing it, that sort of thing. Anything else on strength and conditioning? Yeah.
So going back to the injuries, it's very interesting when you go to see medical help.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that the medics advise keeping as active as you possibly can.
Okay.
Which is very
Okay, the medics are saying that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Have you had a different message from, for example, physios or osteopaths?
No.
No. Okay. Okay.
I mean, I'm currently recovering from a slip disc
A slip disc. Okay.
last year.
Yeah.
That's it. I was getting a lot of residual stiffness and managing to keep active despite that.
Yeah. 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 I mean, personally, for me, I find if I like to have a day off from time to time, completely off. But other than that, I find I just feel better if I'm doing a little bit of activity than complete rest. But I think it's quite individual. For some people, you know, they just want to spend 2 weeks just completely resting, and that's what they need to recover. Do you prefer to stay active?
I prefer to stay active.
Yeah, yeah. I think, I mean, even if you have to do something different, like swimming or biking or whatever, I think it's better to, you know, it gets you out of the house, you see your friends, you often feel better afterwards. Yeah, you lose less of your conditioning. Has anyone got any fantastic good tips on strength and conditioning or injuries they want to share?
I've
Yeah.
started using
Sorry.
I've started using the NICAP.
Okay.
It's just got a whole load of different, if you're not a member of the gym or you're just
Yeah.
doing it at home, it just gives you lots of different workouts, some
Okay.
very specific as well,
Yeah,
designed by athletes,
yeah.
which I do at home if I can't get to the gym, which is
Okay.
quite helpful for those that
Yeah.
are currently
So
doing
that's like a session you can do just
Yeah.
body weight.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. How often do you do that?
Twice a week.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
What app is that again? It's called Nike. It's just Nike app. I can show you after.
Did you have a tip?
Yeah, I mean, my one was I used to have a history of injuries on my left leg.
Yeah.
So about 2 years ago, it started off with kettlebell training. It's 10 minutes a day.
Yeah.
But like more consistent and comfortable with kids more taking training. So
Okay.
I started doing that, really that, like you say,
Yeah.
even old injuries, less
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Okay. Good. Okay. Let's move on. As always, I'm talking way too much. So race preparation. So for me, race preparation is all about. Obviously, you have to train, but apart from training, it's all about the practicalities and the logistics and doing all of that to a point where you know exactly what you're going to be doing on race day and you don't have to worry about it. And if you do that, then the levels of anxiety and nerves will just go, and all you have to do is just turn up and you know what you've got to do on race day. So this is things like learning the course, so going and running the course. If you're racing somewhere like Manchester, then it's maybe not so practical, but somewhere like London, you know, you could even go up to London on a weekend, run part of the course early on a Sunday morning. You could run like the second half or the last 10 miles or something, and then it will be familiar to you on race day. Or you could go to the start area and think, right, this is where I'm going to be lining up, you know, this is how I get here, and then run the course. So anything like that which makes a place familiar just makes a huge difference. If you can't get to the place, then have a really good look at the course map, and if you could do Google Street or Google Earth or something to have a good look at what it actually looks like, that's really helpful as well. Having a goal, I think having a goal for a race is really important. It doesn't matter if you don't stick to it, if you have to throw it out the window and do a plan B as you're going along. But I think having a goal is really important, especially for when the race gets really hard, because otherwise, you know, when it gets hard, it's just too tempting to think, right, I really don't feel good, I'm going to walk or I'm going to slow down or whatever, I'm going to quit. Whereas if you have a goal, that gives you something to focus on and try, if you're having a bad time, try to get back to that. Planning what your goal is going to be is quite tricky, but as the race day approaches, there are a number of different pieces of information you can use to arrive at your goal. So that might be things like if you've done a half marathon, that double it and add X minutes according to your sort of overall estimated goal time. What sort of speed you feel you could complete a marathon in, how your training's been going compared to your last marathon, all these sorts of things. Or if you do a 20-miler, those are really good before a marathon. Use that as a guide to what your goal pace is going to be. So drinks and food during the race. This is getting more and more complicated as more and more companies out there are flogging us their goods. So for me, what this boils down to is what's going to be available on race day. So this is really what is the race providing. And if they're providing a drink, so in the case of London, it's Lucozade. That's the simplest thing to go for, if it agrees with you. And you must try it out in advance on your long runs or whatever. If it agrees with you, that's fantastic. Then you don't have to carry anything, you don't have to worry too much, you just grab the drinks on the day. If it doesn't agree with you, then you've got to you've basically got to take your own stuff. If you decide you want to have some sort of energy. Bearing in mind that back in the 1980s, the Steve Joneses and Charlie Speddings of this world just had a few swigs of water and that was it. This was before all the gels and sports drinks existed. So I think it is worth having something with energy in it, because that could be the difference between you hitting the wall at 24 miles as opposed to at 26.2 miles. So if you can take some energy on, that's great. But you must plan ahead and try it out. I've never done food during a race, but I know some races provide sort of bananas and jelly babies and things like that. I think they're basically fine, although the energy required to digest them is you're gonna have to provide that energy. And also you must try it out beforehand. If you're not so keen on taking on food and drink during the race, one thing to do to sort of mitigate the effect of that is to make sure you really fuel up in the days before and on race day with a good breakfast. I have met people who say they can't have breakfast on race day and they can't take anything on during the race. Just makes their stomach go funny. And I say, okay, so how are you on your long runs? And they say, I'm perfectly fine. So I say, well, just do that then. You know, why would you force food down if it makes you feel terrible? And so whatever you're going to take, it needs to be something that is easy to get down. Because the last thing you need when you're suffering with your running is feeling, oh, I don't really fancy this, but I've got to get it done. Carbo loading is another thing that has become sort of, everybody does it now, but it's easy to overdo with carbo loading, I think, because to store carbohydrate as glycogen in your muscles and in your liver, that's your carbohydrate tank, as it were. To store carbohydrate requires water. So if you really overdo on your carbohydrate, you can end up feeling a bit sort of bloated and not super quick on your feet. So I would say definitely do carb loading, but maybe just eat the amount of food you would normally eat, but just with a higher proportion of carbohydrate rather than eating enormous amounts of carbohydrate. Has anyone had good or bad experiences with carb loading?
I've had good and bad.
Yeah.
My good was when I was drinking carbohydrates. I was drinking sports drinks 3 days before.
Okay.
That was good, and I had not such a good experience where I think I was just eating too much.
Okay.
Too much pasta, too
Yeah.
many potatoes, and I ended up putting on a few pounds.
Okay.
It was only a couple of pounds, but you feel it when you're,
Yeah.
you know, when you're
Yeah.
marathon trained, you do feel a few pounds.
Yeah.
And I ended up feeling quite
On the day.
nasty. So I don't know if you ever use sports drinks to carbo load at all. What your comments would be on that?
Yeah, so I used sports drinks on on the race morning and the day before,
Okay.
because it's a way of hydrating as well.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah, I mean, sports drinks, I'm not a mad keen fan on Lucozade, but just because I find it a bit too sweet, but the sort of slightly lighter ones, I find they're easy to drink, so, and you need to make sure that you're fully hydrated on the start line. So yeah, I think that sports drinks is fine. Yeah. You can overhydrate as well, so drinking too much water has become quite well known as a problem in marathon running, that people think, oh, I've really got to drink loads and loads of water, and that can be in the days leading up or on race day, and that can be really dangerous. It can even be life-threatening. So the best way to monitor that is to think about how often am I going to the toilet, or have I got a headache, or even what colour your urine is. If it's normal, you feel okay, then you're probably okay. But if you're sort of rushing to the toilet or too much, then you've probably drunk too much. Coming back to race day preparation, planning what kit and shoes you're going to wear well in advance, so you just don't have to worry about it at all, is really, really important. And for races in April in the UK, of course you can have anything from sort of snow and quite chilly and miserable to 28 degrees and glorious sunshine. So you do need to be ready for sort of extremes of weather, with anything like sort of sun hats, woolly hats, gloves, top to wear before the start, that sort of thing. Logistics, thinking ahead. So this is things like, how am I going to get to the start? What time am I going to wake up? What time am I going to have breakfast? What am I going to have for breakfast? How much? Have I packed my bag? Have I got a spare pair of shoes? All this kind of thing, so that you just don't have to worry about anything, and you know that if your shoelaces snap on race day or something, it's not the end of the world. I'm a bit of a control freak, as you can probably tell, but you really don't want all your hard work to go down the tubes because of some small logistical problem like that. And then mental preparation. So I think there are a lot of mental tricks you can use to prepare yourself for a marathon. So for example, one is writing down all the really good things that you've done. So that could be the training you've done, eating properly, getting enough sleep, being well organised with your kit and shoes, recceing the course, all that sort of thing. So writing down all the good things you've done to prepare, and then when you start to feel a bit anxious or unconfident, you can look back at that list and think, oh yeah, I did all that really good stuff. Another one is to think, if you're starting to feel a bit negative about the race, another good trick I found is to think what the worst case scenario could be. So the worst case probably is you can't start the race. Worse than that could happen. You could go under a bus and, putting all that aside, the worst is that you're injured and you can't start the race. That would be a massive disappointment, but probably life will go on. You might be able to defer your entry. You've still done a lot of training. Next worst scenario might be you start the race but you can't finish, you have to drop out. Again, that would be really disappointing. It'll probably be a pain getting home, but at the end of the day, life will go on. Then next worst scenario is you miss your goal time by 5 seconds. So if you go through these scenarios, you realise that actually they're not that bad in the big scheme of things. So that can help to sort of lighten the load if you're feeling a bit kind of, oh my god, this marathon's coming and I don't feel ready. Okay. This is the Tokyo Women's Marathon. So the Olympics are coming to Tokyo. Is anyone going to Tokyo for the Olympics? No. Well, Sorry?
No, I'd like to. But
You'd like to, yeah. Yeah.
Not being selected.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's very, very, very hot in Tokyo in July and August, so better to stay in Kidlington and watch on your TV. I think. Yeah. So this is the site of the Olympic Stadium. This race, they've knocked down this stadium and they're building the new stadium. But if any of you make it to Japan after the Olympics, do go to the new stadium because it's pretty amazing. And number 31 is Naoko Takahashi, who was the first woman under 220 ever, and the winner of the Sydney Olympics. And you can see her foot sort of goes to the side on landing, which isn't a very efficient way of running. But she still managed to win the Olympics. So, yeah, you don't have to be perfect to do really well. So it gives us all hope. Yeah. Right, I think that's it. So I've talked a bit too long, but we've still got about an hour. So should we have a quick break and then return with questions and exercises if anyone wants to?
So we'll start again at 1:45.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And my modest medal collection. I'm now thinking, this is over a decade ago now. What am I doing living in the past? Anyway, so let's have some questions.
Yeah, the question I've got is about predicting your marathon pace.
Yeah.
You mentioned that quite a lot of people you see don't sort of reach their potential.
Yeah.
And about key races building up to a marathon. For example, you can do a half marathon.
Yeah.
You also mentioned a 20-miler.
Yeah.
It's your pace, but you wouldn't do a 20-miler at marathon pace fairly near. I would suggest probably 5 weeks before your marathon.
Yeah.
And so, are there any key sessions that you could recommend to predict what your marathon pace could be, like other than the half marathon or 20-mile pacer?
Yeah. So one session I used to do was I used to do a 10k time trial 2 weeks or even a week before. Because 10k is quite short, so you can afford to do it relatively close to the race. You're not going to kill yourself running 10k. What's most useful is if you do the same session sort of consistently year on year at about the same time for a marathon, because then you can compare. So if you do a 10k, let's say a minute faster than what you did at the same time the previous year, then you can kind of use that to say, right, I'm in PB shape. Am I going to go for 4 minutes off my marathon to PB time? So that's one way of doing it. I mean, another way is to do chunks of marathon pace. So, for example, you could do 2 or 3 times 5k at marathon pace, and then that's a long enough amount for you to hopefully be able to judge. Can I keep this going for 42k?
That's interesting, because I know someone who has done that. So if you did say, for example, 3 times 5k, just with a short break in between.
Yeah.
I just wonder how you would expect to feel. I don't know if I'd be confident in myself to know could I.
Yeah, that's a really good point,
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when I was training for marathons, quite often I would go out and do tempo runs. So I would do them kind of as fast as I could for that distance, but I couldn't even reach marathon pace. I couldn't reach my intended marathon pace. So I'd be thinking, blimey, I can't even do this for 10k. How am I going to do it for 42k? But I think when you're in sort of heavy training, you're tired. When you're out there on your own training, it's just not the same as when you're in a race, because you get that adrenaline and you're tapered for the race. Anyone who wears racing shoes, that makes a difference. So I think you can use time trials in races, but hopefully on race day, you will be able to go a little bit quicker. Yeah, but you're right, it's really difficult to judge. So what I found useful is gathering information from different sources. So, for example, you could do a 20 miler 5 weeks out, a half marathon 3 weeks out, a 10k time trial 1 week out maybe.
I like the idea of doing the 10k sort of a couple of weeks before, something like that, 'cause that would,
Yeah,
you've got enough time to recover.
yeah, yeah. And keeping a training diary is also really important in this respect. So if you've kept training diaries, you can look back at the same sessions or similar sessions you've done before. So something, a fairly standard session like 1k reps or mile reps, if you do those from time to time, you can look back, see if you were doing them quicker or slower, and that, if you were doing a set session faster, then that shows that you have improved since, you know, your last marathon. Yeah. I mean, if you're intending to be doing marathons for a long time, you could start now doing a standardized approach to your marathon to help with this. So you can say, right, from now on I'm going to do a half 3 weeks out, I'm going to do a 10k time trial 1 week out, I'm going to do 5 by a mile 10 days out, and then repeat that, and then you've got that data to look back on and judge sort of what sort of shape you're in. Also, when you've finished a marathon, on the finish line, you can ask yourself, right, did I leave 110% out there, or do I actually kind of feel okay? Because if it's the latter, then you probably could have gone a bit faster. And also your half splits. So if you've done a big negative split, then you probably could have gone faster. You've maybe gone off a bit too conservatively in the first half. Equally, if you do a big positive split, you've probably gone off too fast. Yeah. So there was this question here, yeah.
What about heart rate?
Heart rate?
Yeah, it's an indicator for the pace, because it
Yeah.
depends a little on the temperature of the day.
Yeah, so you're talking about using your heart rate on race day, or?
Yeah, I mean, I always use my heart rate. I know if I go at a certain pace, I should, in example, 140 beats per minute.
Yeah.
If I exceed that in a marathon, I'm sure to cramp up the last couple
Yeah.
of miles.
Yeah. So heart rate is an excellent parameter to use. Yeah. And it takes away the variables of like the weather,
Exactly.
temperature. So it's a measure of your effort. Yeah, that's a really good way to do it.
Did you ever use a heart rate monitor?
I did for training,
But not
yeah,
in
but
a
not in a race. No. But I think being able to judge your effort is a really important skill for all runners that we all should develop. And your heart rate is a measure of effort. So in an ideal world, you would be able to develop the ability to judge, you know, roughly kind of, okay, this is okay for a marathon, or this is too fast. So what heart rate is indicating in that scenario? Ideally, we should all be able to judge that kind of our effort in that. I mean, it's a very fine art, but yeah.
I just think a comment that may not be practical to do the calculation of the split, but from days when one religiously followed people like Jeff Galloway, the rule of thumb was to double your half marathon time and add 10%.
Yeah.
Get your target and work backwards from there. So just aim for that pace. I think
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of doing it. Some people say double your half marathon and add X minutes if you're under 3 hours, you know, Y minutes if you're under 3.5. But 10% is another way of doing it. Yeah. At the end of the day, your goal marathon time is going to be a range, isn't it? It's going to be very difficult to be on exactly 3.5 hours or 4 hours or whatever. You know, as you decide on your goal time, you're going to sort of start narrowing it down to, right, it's going to be between 3:10 and 3:20 or whatever it might be. So when it's your first time, then it is a bit of a leap in the dark. Although of course your half marathon time can inform it. And then after the first one, you know, then you can start refining and sort of narrowing that range, target range down. Yeah.
I have 3 questions, if that's okay. But,
Okay.
2 of them are probably quite simple. So the first one is there any benefit or risk associated with training with more weight? So I don't mean just like eating or carrying a backpack or something like that.
Carrying a backpack, okay. Shall I answer that one or do you want to find
Yeah, okay, well I'll ask you the other 2 as well.
Okay.
Judge how long you want to give. So the second one is how long would you recommend tapering for? And the third one is what are race shoes?
What
You
about
mentioned race shoes
what are race
earlier, I don't
shoes?
know what race shoes. Well,
Okay.
I kind of guess, but
Yeah. Okay. So running with weight. Being honest, I've never tried that before. I have run with lots of clothing on when I was trying to heat acclimatise. But yeah, conceivably it could work because you know, you're having to carry more weight. So once you take that weight off, you're going to feel really light. I think you would want to do it in a form where you're definitely not going to get injured, and I would maybe limit the amount that you do. So I'm not sure, for example, you would do a really long run carrying a backpack. But yeah, it's a form of resistance training, I guess. Yeah. And then the taper. So I used to do a 3-week taper, but I think that's actually really quite long. I think you can, I mean, to be honest, I think a week is enough. It also depends a bit how your training has gone. So if you've had for you, a really big training build-up, you've been in lots of miles, training really hard, then you really do need to taper from that, because you'll be really tired. If you have not been able to train that much, or you've had interruptions with colds or whatever, then there's less load that you need to taper from. So I think you can afford to do a bit less. But the main piece of advice I give for taper is always go back and remember what the purpose of the taper is. The purpose of the taper is for you to stand on the start line, like absolutely raring to go. You know, you're bouncing off the walls. You're absolutely pumped for this race, mentally, physically, in every way. And you just have to do whatever it takes to reach the start line in that state. And if that means 3 weeks, 1 week, 2 days, eating a lot, going to a party, whatever it is, just do it. And it'll be different for different people. You know, so for some people they might want to just totally get away from running, or you know, having 5 days completely off running, that might give you that sort of, you know, I really want to get out and run feeling. So whatever works for you, yeah. And then racing shoes. So racing shoes are just really lightweight shoes designed for racing on the road, so they don't have spikes in them. This is a pair of racing shoes, so they're just not, they look like trainers, but they're very light, and they have less cushioning. And because they're light and they're quite sort of flexible, it just feels like you can go faster in them. You can get a bit more on your toes, they're lighter.
Would you train with those now as well?
So I used to do speed sessions in those sorts of shoes, and I would occasionally do tempo runs in them, yeah. But there's less cushioning, so you get more wear and tear. So if you've never used them before, you do need to sort of break them in, get used to them. But yeah, I swear by them. A marathon is obviously a long way to do in shoes with not much cushion. And you'll feel more wear and tear than doing in trainers. But I think they'll knock minutes off your time, yeah. I mean, if you get used to these, then it's hard to go back to trainers. It's a bit of a one-way journey. Yeah.
Did you have a sort of phasing to your year of running? So say you've got the April Marathon, did you do sort of strength and conditioning across the summer and then or speed work in summer? You know,
Yeah.
how do you fit your year?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So I basically used to do, well, I did marathons in the spring, autumn, but then I quite often did summer marathons as well. So I would usually do a 3-month marathon build-up. If I didn't have a marathon, and then I was usually doing shorter races, then I would do much more speed work, focus on speed work, reduce the length of my long runs, less overall volume. Strength and conditioning I would tend to do sort of early on in a build-up, and then reduce it to a kind of maintenance load, and then reduce it right down before a race. Yeah, I think that really helps with keeping things fresh if you change what you're doing through the year. And of course there aren't really many marathons at all in the summer, so the summer is the obvious time to do shorter races, trail races, and also with endurance running, you know, there are races all year round, unlike for the track, so it's easy to fall into the trap of just racing all the time and you never really get a proper break. So if you're planning sort of chunks of time through the year, don't forget to include a sort of off season of a few weeks where you just don't do any running, or just back off and let your body recover. Yeah.
And psychologically, when things don't go to plan,
Yeah.
how do you get back on the horse? You know,
Yeah.
you must have had several occasions where you
Yeah.
got a niggly injury or you plateauing. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Do you mean in a race or in general?
in your training towards your race, so
Yeah.
I mean, you've run some amazing races, but you know, there must always be that kind of temptation of, oh, how could I have done it faster, or this one wasn't as fast as I would like it to be. How do you cope with that when you've got another 3 months coming to the next race?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, if training's going badly and you've got a race coming up, then it is really tough. I guess one thing is just to focus on one day at a time. So just do your absolute best today and don't worry too much about what's coming in the future. So if you're coping with an injury or just feeling overtrained, then sort of doing your rehab, getting enough rest, eating properly. Because as soon as you think, right, I've got this race coming but I'm not in shape or things aren't going well, it's easy to get into a downward sort of spiral. So just taking it one step at a time. Thinking about what the worst is that can happen. So, you know, the worst case scenario probably is that you can't do the race. The most difficult build-up, I think, was when I had an injury. So that's, you know, when you're trying to prepare for a marathon with an injury, it's really stressful because you're constantly thinking, right, you know, should I just bin this whole thing, or do I just persevere? How bad is it? How do you deal with injuries? Really difficult. So you can, as long as you're continuing, I would say just focus on one day at a time. But if you do need to pull the plug on a race, then remember that you've not lost everything. You know, you've still done good training. Yeah. And then if something goes wrong in a race, so for example, you end up with a disappointing result compared to how fit you were, then just making sure you don't repeat that mistake and learning from it the next time. Yeah. I mean, running's a learning process. Yeah. I mean, very few people produce an amazing run first time. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, what do you think about fasted runs?
Yeah.
And do you think that there's a space for it in someone's training for a marathon?
Yeah.
Is it effective? Perhaps in some kind of like improving your energy, fueling and energy, burning your energy.
Yeah.
And the second question is regarding threshold runs.
Yeah.
Would you be doing the same 6 mile or 7-8 mile run at the same pace as you would be doing 3 times 2 miles repeats?
Okay.
So would you be, because you mentioned something like that at the beginning?
Yeah.
Is there space to do the repeats a little bit faster?
Yeah, I
At
think
the same pace, and
Yeah.
how low would you go from your mile pace?
Yeah, I think there is scope to do like 3 by 2 miles a little bit quicker. Sort of mentally as much as anything, you know, you only have to run 2 miles rather than 8, so you know there's a little break coming. I wouldn't, it's so difficult to say in terms of minutes per mile. I think effort is a better thing to use in that scenario, so you could just crank up the effort a little bit if you're doing long intervals rather than a full tempo run. Yeah, I mean with a long tempo run, psychologically they're much harder because you know you're going to go through a lot of pain for a long time. So I try to kind of break it up in my mind, even if it's not broken up in actual time. So just think, right, let's just do 1 kilometre and then another kilometre, rather than thinking, oh, I've got 8k or 10k or whatever.
Do you find that metabolically speaking it gets easier after 20 minutes or 25 or, for example, because I always, in my threshold runs, I always have trouble after, I don't think it's psychological either. I think that it does have to do with energy.
Yeah. I mean, when you first start running far, your body can use lactic acid as a fuel. So when you first start running fast, your lactate might go up and then down a bit as you start to use it as a fuel, and then up again. But that would occur quickly in the first few minutes. So I'm not sure about after 20 minutes. I mean, maybe it's just that you're fully warmed up and you're into the, you know, you've got a few miles out the way, the finish is coming soon. You know, there are few things harder than the first few miles of a long tempo run, because you know the pain started, but there's still a long way to go. Yeah. And then on fasted runs, yeah, I think this is getting a bit beyond my nutritional expertise. If there are any nutritionists in the room, please say. But I think certainly I used to run first thing in the morning without eating anything. I would have a coffee and then just run. And I think because you're fasted, I think you are going to be burning more fat than carbohydrate, because you're low on carbs if you've been asleep all night. I think there is a trade-off though with quality. So I think it can be a struggle to do, for example, a really good quality speed session if you're fasted. I think it depends also when in the day you do it. So it's easier to do a fasted run first thing in the morning than in the evening, because if you're working and trying to fast at the same time, then it comes to the evening, you're probably exhausted. You're maybe not going to want to go and train. So I think there's definitely a place for it, but you could possibly sacrifice quality. Yeah. Have you tried doing fasted runs?
Only by necessity. I don't know if they would help in terms of, if they benefit your marathon result, let's say, your performance, then maybe I would do them more systematically, but no, I wouldn't say that I've been doing them regularly.
Yeah.
No.
I think they must help fat burning if you do it first thing in the morning, certainly when you're fasted. Are there any dietitians in the room who can help us on this one?
I think the theory is that the idea is that it helps to train your body to burn fat as opposed to carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So I think that's why the recommendation of doing it. I
Yeah.
do remember seeing an experiment on TV
Okay.
a few years ago where they actually split up, and it demonstrated that actually men coped better with fasted running than women.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I think, like you said before, you've got to try it.
Yeah.
what works for you.
Yeah. It's quite individual as well if you can actually get up and go for a run without eating anything. I know people who say I can't, I have to have like a banana or something. Yeah.
But it's about quality, because you reach that point where
Yeah.
I can go out and run 6 miles on fasted, but if I'm out to 8, then the
Yeah.
last 2 you sort of
You lose the quality. Yeah. Also, if you try to do a long run fasted, you're going to hit the wall much sooner than if you were fueled up. So there's a danger there that you can't complete a good quality long run. But equally, if you want to get your body down into the no fuel zone, by way of practice, or trying to train your body to cope with that, then doing a long run fasted is going to allow you to do that. But then you get that affects your immunity. It might take you 2 or 3 days to get back into fueled up enough to do quality training again. So I guess it's a weighing up. Yeah. I mean, a lot of running is like that. It's weighing up the benefits of one thing over another. Really long runs is another one. So there is a real benefit to doing really long runs. But then if you're wiped out till Thursday of the next week, was it worth it? Because you've had to skip your track session or whatever. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the sort of psychological, I suppose, aspect of marathon racing and how you thought about the 26 miles. Well, I guess one part of the question is how you thought about the halfway split and what you were aiming for, and perhaps what you think about like even splits versus negative, or but secondly, like sort of how you thought about the different sections of the race. Did you break it down into smaller bits and that?
Yeah. So I always found the first half much easier than the second half. Obviously. So the first half was always, I was just really concentrating on just sort of getting into the race, making sure I'm roughly doing the pace I want to be doing, making sure I get drinks, those early drinks without any trouble. Just staying out of trouble is really the top priority in the first half of the race. You really don't want to waste your energy on anything other than getting from A to B as efficiently as possible. And then in the second half, between sort of halfway and 18 miles, I would always have to resist the temptation to think, right, we're in the home straight now, this is going to get easier, because obviously it isn't. So that's quite a tough section, because you're starting to get tired, but you're still quite a long way from the end. And then once you're past sort of 20 miles, then you're probably starting to really hurt, but you are getting towards the finish. And I guess I was often, that's the section where you really start racing people if you're in that sort of scenario. I mean, some of the races I did were all about qualifying for another race. So in that scenario, all I was concerned about was the time. So I did a race in that scenario where a group of us went through halfway, and then the pace suddenly dropped right off, and that was no good for me because I was going to miss my qualifying time. So I went to the front, picked up the speed again, but then I ended up sort of pacing everybody else and got beat at the end. But I managed to get the time I needed. So it depends a little bit on the scenario. I think even splits is sort of in theory the best way to run a marathon if it's a flat course. London has a big downhill section in the first half, so it's really difficult to do even splits in London. So a slightly positive split is kind of the same thing as even splits in London. It's really difficult to do completely even splits, but that is the most efficient way to run a race, because any variation from that means when you're going faster than your overall average time, you're burning off more carbohydrate than you need to be. So any variation in effort is sort of wasted energy. So I guess if I were going to give advice on that, I would say just try and keep out of trouble as much as you possibly can until certainly into the second half, and then if you're feeling okay, then think, right, can I pick it up, or can I pick off a few people, that sort of thing. Yeah. Have you had sort of good or bad experiences of that sort of thing?
I've only done one marathon in October, and it just helped me to have a halfway target.
Yeah.
Pretty much even splits. So.
you finish the race feeling you'd given 100%, or were you?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Well, that sounds like you paced it really well. Yeah. You set the bar quite high for your second marathon. Has anyone else had sort of good or bad experiences on pacing?
The only interesting experience I had when I used to do marathons, I went to one race I ran. I saved up so much, I held back so much in the first half of the race, and felt I had so much to do in the second half of the race, and I ended up doing a negative split
Okay.
by about 5 minutes.
Wow. Okay.
So I came home from that, thinking, oh, I could have done a little bit more.
Yeah. 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 So next time, did you go off a bit more ambitiously?
A bit more ambitiously, and I was a bit more even.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah. I mean, if you have experiences like that where you could have done a bit better, the only thing you can do is learn from it and not repeat that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's better to do that than go off too fast and do a big positive split. That can be quite a negative experience.
That's a different story.
Yeah.
So look at the course layout first.
Sorry?
It's best to look at the course and see if it's
Hilly,
first time or
yeah.
vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so, yeah. I mean, has anyone done Boston or planning to do Boston? Yeah. So that's very hilly. I mean, how do you pace Boston? You can't just have a go.
You know, first it's so much downhill in the first section, and then it's very elevated and you're into the 60s.
Yeah. So is it easy to get carried away in the early stages?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Another one I like to watch, in particular with city marathons, is if it's windy.
Yeah.
Because I can certainly remember once running London, 16 miles, being fine for 16 miles, and suddenly turning into a funnel headwind.
Yeah.
That allows you to stop.
Yeah. I mean, headwind is really, really tough, especially if it goes on for a long time. Yeah.
Like a nice little clear as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your question about racing and time trials. Say for example, particularly the spring marathon, you've got say cross country season at the moment. Like, do you find that it's a problem balancing out shorter distance races whilst you might be training for a marathon at the same time? Or is there a good way to balance those and still get good results?
Yeah. I think cross country generally is really good. It's really tough, so it's a good cardiovascular workout. It gives you a bit of a sort of conditioning workout because the ground is uneven and so on. So I think definitely just do your cross country races because they're like a top quality tempo run if you run them quite hard, and you know they're quite long, so they're really good marathon training. They're no good with judging your marathon pace because quite obviously. And I would say that the time to judge your goal marathon pace is much nearer to the marathon. It's way too early to be worrying about that now. And the cross-country races tend to be early, you know, they're January, February, March typically. So do them now because this is your main training phase. And then much nearer to April, that's when you need to be thinking, right, you know, what is my goal marathon pace? And do your half marathon or time trial or whatever it might be, because it's still a long time till late April.
So that makes me ask another question then, because I know some marathon plans have you thinking about your running at marathon pace like almost halfway through or something like that. Is that kind of like not the best idea? You can still have quite a bit of flexibility.
See, I mean, the thing about marathon pace is, or the thing about any kind of training is you have to ask yourself, what benefit is it giving me? And in terms of intensity, so if we go from slow to fast, really easy running, fast jog, which I talked about earlier, then you've got what I call steady, then you've got sort of long reps threshold, then you've got short reps, sprints. And all those different things give you some benefit. So easy running, not much physiological adaptation, but it might help you loosen up, it adds miles to the bank, so on. Fast jog is good for fat burning, building an aerobic engine. Steady running, that's quite like marathon pace. It's a bit challenging, it's still quite good for fat burning, you can probably do quite a large amount of it, and so on. And then the anaerobic, that's about toleration of lactic acid, fast leg turnover, speed, so on. So marathon pace, you have to ask yourself, what is it giving you? And it's kind of in that steady category. So yes, it's fat burning and so on, but you just, and it has its place, but you just need to make sure that you're doing other types of training which will bring on your fitness.
So, I mean, is it fair to say, like, you think about marathon pace, you should just kind of, not say you should completely chuck, like, a number of minutes per mile out the window, but just a lot more feeling about, are you feeling like you're doing easy work? Are you feeling like you're doing hard, intense work? Things like that.
I think that's kind of a more useful way to do it. And also, how accurately you predict your marathon pace has a massive impact. So if you really underestimate your marathon pace, so let's say for sake of argument you can do a 3-hour marathon and you set your marathon pace at 3.5 hours and you go out and do a lot of training at 3.5 hour pace, that's going to be really easy for you. So that's basically easy jogging. So it's not really giving you that much benefit, whereas equally if you sort of overestimate, you think you're a 2.5 hour runner, but actually you're a 3 hour runner, and you go out and do lots of running at 2.5 hour pace, that's going to be quite anaerobic, and you're going to do lots of anaerobic running, which has its benefit, but the marathon is an aerobic event. So I think it's more useful to organise your training around those intensities, forget about marathon pace until much nearer the time, and then think, okay, so my ballpark figure is 3.5 hours or whatever. Is that realistic? Is it too fast? Is it too slow? Do I need to adjust it? Yeah, because your marathon pace can change. You know, hopefully between now and April you will all improve in fitness. You'll all get faster, hopefully. That's the goal. So you know, if you fix, right, my marathon pace is 3.5 hours, but actually come April you're a 3:10 runner, say, but you've got this 3.5 hours in your head, then you're going to kind of miss out on what your potential is. Yeah.
How do you, or what would you put down in getting from like a good club runner to like your sort of standard? How do you think?
I think it's basically just doing marathon specific training, doing hard training consistently, but also really working at the non-training elements, so nutrition, sleep, looking after yourself so you don't get injured, making sure you're really well prepared for races, having a plan kind of a few years into the future. It's really not rocket science. People think it is, but it really isn't. It's just hard training and doing all those other things are what enable you to do hard training. So eating properly, getting enough sleep and so on. Yeah. I mean, you need support around you as well. You know, so it's, being a family member to a runner is not the easiest thing in the world. Yeah.
What was the time scale that you kind of went from kind of club running to then elite standard?
Oh, decades. Yeah. So I was sort of, well, I started off in Headington Road Runners when I was a teenager, and then when I was a student I was sort of student level, and then I sort of got to national level. Then I went off and worked for several years and didn't do much running. Then I came back to it, got to about 2:40 in the marathon, and then by that stage I was working part-time, so that was a big help because I had much more time to rest and do physio and all that sort of stuff. I mean, elite athletes live the life of luxury compared to people who have jobs and you know, in the real world. But it takes years to build up, to get to a really high level. It's just years of hard work. You know, very few people go from being a good club runner to elite in a short time, unless they've got chemical assistants helping them. If you're really, really talented, you can do it in a short time. But for most people, it just takes years of graft. Yeah. Any other questions? How are we doing for time? Oh,
Pretty much.
we're out of time.
So if you have just run a marathon, let's say in October,
Yeah.
and you want to run another one in 6 months' time, which
Yeah.
would be in April,
Yeah.
would you be using the results from that marathon to base, for example, say, oh, you know, this is my marathon base, my current level of fitness is
Yeah.
this, the October result,
Yeah.
and so start working based on that, and
Yeah.
then maybe, you know, decrease, let's say, your marathon training pace, whatever, as you go along.
Yeah,
Would you be
I think
using
that's
that
a
race?
sensible way to do it. As long as the October race was okay, you know, if you had a disaster, then you can be a bit more ambitious next time. But if you had a reasonably good race, then it's reasonable to expect, if you're training consistently, that you will continue to improve. Yeah, so you can afford to say, right, let's aim for 5 minutes quicker, or yeah, I think you
5
can.
minutes quicker, yes.
Or, well, that's just an example. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends. In October, did you feel you'd given 100%, or did you feel you could have gone faster?
Personally speaking, it was not just referring to me, but yeah, I had an experience in October, which
Yeah.
was interesting in the sense that I was injured in September,
Okay.
so I didn't have the time to do any training,
Yeah.
and I just did long runs.
Okay.
That was the only thing I could do
Okay.
in that short amount of time, which was like about 6 weeks
Yeah.
to 7 weeks.
Okay.
And interestingly, nothing worked.
Okay.
I mean, I think I got the most out of that sort of training
Yeah.
that I could have gotten. So,
Yeah. Okay.
so that was okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So probably, if you're not injured now and you're able to do more training, speed training, then probably you can be quite ambitious, because that was 6 weeks of only long runs. That's quite
Long and medium long, so we
Yeah.
had sort of three longer runs in the week, and that was it.
okay.
Slow pace, slower.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a reasonable preparation, but it's not optimal because you had an injury. So next time, now, if you can build up with a bit of different training, a bit of speed work without injury, then I think it's reasonable to expect that you could do better. Yeah. I mean, if it turns out that you run worse in April, then you have to ask yourself, right, a menu of only long runs, maybe that's what works for me. Yeah. I'm not saying it is necessarily.
Weather
but
allowing and everything else being equal, of course. Because,
Yeah.
you know,
yeah, yeah. I met a chap recently who ran to work every day 12 kilometres, but at a reasonable pace, and that was all he did except for a long one on the weekend. So no intervals, only 12k, but every day, and he ran 240 of it. So I said, what speed are you doing this 12k? And he said, you know, I'm not hanging around. So I think he was doing a lot of that fast jog steady intensity, which is ideal for the marathon because it builds you a big aerobic engine. I think he was in that ballpark, and he was doing it every day for a reasonable distance, plus a long run. So I think actually, sort of by accident, he arrived at quite a good menu for the marathon. Could have been even better if he had a bit more speed training in there. But so sometimes you arrive by accident at something which really works for you, and that's why you need a training diary. Yeah. We should stop there, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
So I'd like to obviously thank Mara very much for coming on and giving us good insight into what it takes to be a good marathoner. I wish you all a lot of luck for your marathons in the spring. So yeah, if you'd like to join me for a round of applause. Thanks. so much for joining us, and I hope you have a good trip home. If I could ask one or two of the Kidlington runners to stay behind to help me clear up, that'd be really helpful.